Hi there. So, welcome to the last Holloway-based event of the semester, or at least Holloway poetry-based event of the semester. This event is not, strictly speaking, part of the regular spring Holloway reading series, but it is central to that series' intention and source. Tonight we'll hear from the 2008 Roberta C. Holloway Lecturer in the Practice of Poetry, Lytle Shaw, in recognition of his significant creative work, in this case both on and off the page, and to express gratitude for his attention to our undergraduate poets this semester. Among previous Holloway poets are such notable figures as Michael Palmer, Paul Muldoon, Yusef Komunyakaa, Anne Carson, and our own Robert Haas and Lynn Heginian. I'm just going to tell you briefly about the nature of this lectureship. It came into existence in 1981 through a bequest given to the university as part of the estate of Roberta C. Holloway, who received her BA degree in English with honors from UC Berkeley in 1923, and a good year for poetry, and her PhD in English here 23 years later in 1945, a bad year for the world. As required by the terms of the bequest, the committee supervising the lectureship was chaired by Josephine Miles for as long as she was an active faculty member. Josephine Miles, who died in 1985 at the age of 74, was the first woman to be tenured in Berkeley's English department. Perhaps more important, she was a nationally recognized and much honored poet whose work now has canonical status in the history of American poetry of the 20th century. And I'm going to read you a brief example of that work. This is a poem called Kind. When I think of my kindness, which is tentative and quiet, and of yours, which is intense and free, I am in elaboration of knowledge, impatient of even the patientest immobility. I think of my kind, which is the human fortune, to live in the world and make war among its friends, and of my version, which is to be moderately peaceful, and of your version, and must make amends by my slow word to your wish, which is mobile, active, and moving in its generous sphere. This is the natural and the supernatural of humankind, of which I grow aware. I'm now going to turn over the podium to my esteemed colleague Lynn Heginian, who will introduce Lytle Shaw properly.
It is for me a special honor and a deep personal pleasure to introduce Lytle Shaw tonight, as it has been to have him here as the 2007-2008 Holloway Lecturer in the Practice of Poetry. That Lytle should hold a lectureship in the practice of poetry seems especially apt, since in all of his work, one can see a dedication to an elaboration of what such a practice entails, as a set of possibilities, as a set of obligations, as the carrying out of a critical methodology, as an investment in lived experience, as a site of crisis, which on occasion is also a site of merriment. Situated within a deep understanding of post-Enlightenment despair, Lytle's work over and over recovers Enlightenment wonder. And if the thus enlightened world seems bizarrely askew, well, then we've learned something more about reality. I speak of Lytle's work. It is the outcome of not one, but of numerous practices. The terms poet-scholar or artist-critic only encapsulate a small part of the range of the practices that he shapes into and out of poetry. He works variously, and in some cases idiosyncratically, as an uncredentialed archivist and archaeologist, as a hobby scientist, as a demanding and generative editor, as a cultural historian, a comedian, tour director, art critic, university professor, curator, political activist, literary publisher, and of course, as a poet. Lytle did his undergraduate work in architecture at Cornell and his graduate work in English here at UC Berkeley. He is now an assistant professor of English at NYU. For several years, he served as the literary director of the Drawing Center in New York City. He is the former editor of Shark, a journal of poetics and art writing, and of Shark Books, both of which he co-founded with a New York-based painter, Emily Clark. He is currently a contributing editor and frequent contributor to Cabinet Magazine, a spectacularly interesting and even inspiring journal of conceptual art and cultural production. With a long-standing interest in conceptual art and site-specific art, he has contributed significantly to studies of such artists as, among others, Robert Smithson, the Irish poet Gerard Byrne, Nina Kachadurian, Mark Dion, the Swedish artist Jakob Nordstrom, and the Royal Art Lodge, an art-making collective based in Winnipeg. In collaboration with the artist Jimbo Blakely, Lytle has conducted guided architectural tours of sections of Lower Manhattan. Lytle Shaw's published books of poetry include Low Level Bureaucratic Structures, a novel, Cable Factory 20, and The Lobe. He is also the author of a number of chapbooks and of at least 2 mixed media collaborations with Emily Clark. His critical study, titled Frank O'Hara, The Poetics of Coterie, came out a year and a half ago, and an anthology he edited from his curatorial work, 19 Lines, a Drawing Center Anthology, came out last year. Since 2004, Shaw has co-edited the Chadwick family papers with the artist Jimbo Blakely. Installations and performances related to this material have occurred at PS1, MoMA, Wave Hill, PS122, Bartram's Garden, ICA, Philadelphia, and the Queen's Museum. A solo exhibition of their work will take place this October at Winkleman Gallery in New York to coincide with the publication of the Chadwick family papers. He has 2 other forthcoming books that I'm aware of, and since he is prolific on so many fronts, it is very possible there are more. One of the 2 I know about is a scholarly work on site specificity and poetry. The other is harder to categorize, which is entirely to the point. Lytle integrates into his work a vast array of historical, social, aesthetic, visual, and literary interests and areas of expertise. I use the word integrates intentionally. Temporal and spatial associations abound. Logics, which is to say linkages, proliferate. Materials drawn from different zones assemble. But a marked degree of disintegrative proficiency is involved in Lytle's artistic, literary, and critical work too. He has a profound and a profoundly informed interest in physical structures, which is to say, in the spatial instantiations of ideas, and in cultural structures, which is to say, the temporal manifestations of developing community histories. From his youthful practical and theoretical studies of architecture and spatial design to his comprehensive studies of conceptual and sculptural spaces in the work of late modernist and early postmodern art, and in the works of artists like Robert Smithson to his book on Frank O'Hara and his circle, a study of the socio-aesthetic, social, or community structures that, not merely metaphorically, housed the New York School of Poets and Painters in the Cold War years and subsequently. These interests also inform such books as his Low Level Bureaucratic Structures, a novel which borrows playfully from the structural principles of the comic book and how to draw manuals. Principles of the Emeryville shell mound, researched and written when he lived in Emeryville as a graduate student, and borrowing from the structural principles and perhaps ideological assumptions underlying archaeological and ethnographic studies, and Cable Factory 20, a serial work that is, quite literally as well as conceptually, mapped onto maps, or oriented within orientation, a bit like the wheel in the middle of a wheel that Ezekiel saw way up in the sky. At the same time, Lytle's investigations into structures, social structures, the structures of desire, especially when that takes form as a work of art, and there is probably no work of art that is not also a work of desire, architectural and architectonic structures, bureaucratic structures, power structures, the structures of cultural life. His investigations into these structures often take the form of a disruptive intervention. The liveliness of his intelligence and the energetic character of his quest for knowledge can never be fully satisfied by stabilities. Humor is one of his most original and most delightful heuristic devices. It is also one of his most serious aesthetic devices. It marks an eruption of consciousness that rises in defiance of the reductively epiphanic. It emits heterogeneity, a flash of social explosiveness. It lights our way into the terrain of ludic, but never ludicrous, invention. Please welcome Lytle Shaw.
Thanks, Lynn. Thanks, Jeffrey. Can people hear me okay? I'm periodically going to be going over to tap that. My talk tonight is called The Chadwick Family Papers, A Brief Public Glimpse. I don't want to call it a talk, though. You'll see why. For the past few years, I've tended to change the subjects when friends ask me about my poetry writing. Oh, it's going fine. How's your work going? Whereupon a long discussion usually ensues, and we're through the crisis. Not that I haven't been writing regularly and somewhat maniacally. I've even written a number of pieces that could be and have been read as poems. And yet the term poetry poorly papers over an enterprise that requires a far lengthier, messier discussion with what I suspect is a different set of categories. So I avoid the topic. And yet there are times when publicly and institutionally I'm required to demonstrate a slightly more specific relation to the ancient discipline of poetry. Having been generously invited to Berkeley this semester to teach poetry, and having more or less successfully avoided the question in the first 13 weeks of my seminar, I realized, however, that tonight at this reading another approach would be necessary. So here we go. Consider Eckermann passing through Weimar to pay tribute to Goethe, his luminary hero, when lo, Goethe's Olympian glance fastened intensely upon the young writer, first encouraging him to stay a few days more, then a few more, then gradually not mentioning leaving at all. Soon it had been 9 years, that is, all the moments remaining in Goethe's life. It was as if Eckermann hadn't even looked up and taken stock of his new situation. So busy had he been transcribing every syllable pronounced by the aging genius. This event took place nearly 200 years ago. Still, it's what first comes to mind when I try to describe the effect on me of being selected, along with my assistant, the illustrator, Jay Blatchley, as an editor of the Chadwick Family Papers. It was sudden and irrevocable. If the job, for it is a job at one level despite the almost entire lack of compensation, if the job instrumentalized my own labors as a writer, claiming these in my research for a new purpose, the purpose itself seemed so immeasurably greater than that to which I'd bent myself before, that my own relativization became a transcendent thrill. But since the Chadwick family has shunned the public eye for several centuries, and their authors remain, however unfairly, less household names than Goethe, since our age is more suspicious, and since the Chadwicks have of late been embroiled in a number of controversies, I thought today, in this educational context, I would present my friends, my former teachers, and my current students with an introduction to the Chadwick archives, explaining as delicately and precisely as I can the nature of my work for the family, especially on the monuments to the 17th century New Amsterdam Chadwicks, or Chadwikes, that was to have been installed on Hanover Square last May, almost exactly a year ago, but which, for reasons I'll elaborate in what follows, remains even now frozen in a shipping crate. Since 2004, I've directed a team of editors overseeing the Chadwick Family Archive. While we have considerable leeway with the papers, artifacts, and works of art, theirs is a proud and ancient family of dandies, aesthetes, amateur historians, and sea captains that, now in the face of its more recent financial troubles, remains anxious about its position in history. For this reason, we're obliged to find a place in our work for the contributions of the family's own historians and to respond to the Chadwicks' exacting editorial suggestions. Our editorship is thus a collaboration not merely between Blatchley and myself, but between us and the Chadwicks. And yet the richness of the family's archive far outweighs the administrative dilemmas and complex matters of etiquette sometimes involved in bringing it before the public. A large portion of our task as editors has been to prepare educational installations and informational events about the family at the request of museums and nonprofit arts institutions. I'll just show you a few of these here. What has been a surprise to me in my research, however, has been the rather Byzantine connections historically between the Chadwicks and these same institutions, a topic that has made for some embarrassment and even ill will. But as scholars, we felt it our duty to present these histories without simplifying or sanitizing them. Indeed, Blatchley and I could not be more revolted by the now several-decade turn in museum display away from rigor and detail and toward spurious claims about access and interactivity. But that's another topic. The first of these events has come to be known as Errant Walker. It was spurred by an invitation from Grisdale, an English arts organization that explores the legacy of English Romanticism, especially the persistence of its images. After some research, we discovered the very real possibility that the Johnny Walker's Striding Man logo, with us day and night as we stroll any urban center, was, though uncredited, in fact based on a sketch of Chadwick Dalton done by the English novelist and travel writer William Beckford. In retrospect, it may have been a mistake to have informed the Chadwicks of our discovery, since before we could complete the research, members of the family, Torrent Chadwick and Chadwick Dalton, two of the most active and frankly most difficult Chadwicks, were in New York ready to press a poorly formed legal case. Or at least, they were ready to find suitable lodgings from which they could stroll the New York avenues. In fact, they soon seemed far more interested in the myriad questions bound up with the selection of their living quarters than in those of their legal case. One afternoon, in which they toured downtown Manhattan, debating about how some of the largest, most ostentatious condominiums then under construction might be tricked out into the kind of elaborate, exotic fantasy dens they saw as their imperial birthright, this transcript of the debate was thankfully preserved by their manservant, Smithson. Though the Chadwicks' frank and indulgent conversation in Errant Walker can have pleased few contemporary solicitors, still, the family was contacted the following year by Cabinet Magazine and the Queen's Museum of Art, who were working on an exhibition of Gordon Matta Clark's project, Fake Estates, in which the New York artist bought a series of tiny, unoccupiable sites, 71 feet by 16 inches, for instance, that had been produced by surveyors' errors. The proposal was that the Chadwicks might lead the curious public on a tour of 4 of these sites. Though Blatchley and I are not certain of the point, we believe that these institutions may have contacted the family on the strength of a persistent rumor that the Chadwick estate held significant, unseen Matta Clark material. In any case, they were not disappointed. Matta Clark had lived in a building owned by a little-known Chelmsford Chadwick, uncle to one of the family's amateur historians. When Gordon was not forthcoming with his rent, Uncle Chelmsford had been forced to appropriate various pieces of the artist's work. These drawings and sculptures, which were unveiled for the first time on the trip, titled Wandering Plots, A Grand Tour of Matta Clark's Queens, sustained a radical new reading of the artist's project, which the Chadwicks themselves presented in detail while the bus visited 4 sites. Fake Estates was not about the simple dichotomy between owning and occupying land, but rather, having emerged from the artist's classical architecture education, his belated version of the Grand Tour, and his urbanist research into the borough's extensive and characteristic graveyards, Gordon's project was in fact a solemn memorial to Queens's fundamental architectural unit, the plot. This brings us to the Chadwicks' ill-fated exhibition in Philadelphia, Bad Seed. which documented their ongoing archaeological work on Hieronymus Chadwick Bartram in relation to his better-known relative, the 18th century American botanist John Bartram. John Bartram, as some of you might know, he made his money by selling seeds to 18th century English lords who were reforesting their estates. Presented on the grounds of Bartram's Garden in conjunction with the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia, the Chadwicks' sunken vitrine of specimens and texts, which was later destroyed either by the adolescent neighbors or by the curators, reconstructed the bizarre history of H.C. Bartram's attempt, in effect, to graft himself onto the Bartram family's lucrative seed business by courting Elizabeth Bartram, William's twin sister, born in 1739, around 1824, when she was in her mid-80s and he was in his late teens. Because of Elizabeth's senility, Hieronymus's argument that the two were married may in fact have been true. In any case, it was the basis of his adopting the Bartram's last name in a much frowned upon reversal of the period's practice and entering the family seed business to disastrous results, including fraud, conflagration, drunkenness, breaking and entering, and taxonomic incompetence. Concerns about the project prompted the curators to require that the vitrine be placed at the far swampy corner of the Bartram Garden grounds, just across a broken fence from an abandoned gypsum factory. Neighborhood children roared through this area, tearing up the ground on their four-wheel off-road motorcycles. Yellow police tape lingered from a recent murder. Worse than the sighting, however, the curators also requested that we make public the family papers on which our research had been based. Because the Chadwicks sternly refused on principle to comply with such a request, Blatchley and I were forced to compose a brief text, detached sentences on the Chadwicks, out of the family's historic press clippings, personal correspondence, and memorabilia. Though it was designed to put to rest the curators' questions, unfortunately neither they nor the Chadwicks were quite satisfied. And yet I hope that disinterested readers like yourselves may nonetheless benefit from these sentences. That's what the piece wound up looking like. Arrayed comfortably each evening on their various verandas, the sun in fact never sets on the Chadwick family. Though amateurs, the Chadwicks are utterly professional. Perhaps because of their easy upper-crust manners and ready wit, the Chadwicks have at times been entrusted, their detractors say, with responsibilities in excess of their actual abilities. In view of your family's broad historic contributions to culture and with the knowledge of the good intentions underlying your misrepresentations, we will let you go, this time with a warning. Several of the songs and all of the photographs on the Japanese pop band Pizzicato 5's record Made in USA are rumored to have been inspired by the Chadwicks. In view of your enormous debts, repeated public drunkenness, and above all, your reckless disregard for the facts of others' private histories, I shall have to suggest that as a learning experience, the likes of which will last you a lifetime, you join the intimate pastoral community at Sing Sing for a period not less than 12 months. One or other of the Chadwicks has often been seen fast asleep over a cheap novel in the den of the Algonquin Club. The Chadwicks have ceased reading the daily paper's reports on the Chadwicks. In the aftermath of their ferocious spats, the Chadwicks have often been heard to raise a glass with the toast, "Consensus is overrated." While other New York connoisseurs have loudly bemoaned the loss of Asher Duran's beloved kindred spirits to the Walmart family, the Chadwicks have quietly begun following the painting. Some scholars have taken exception to a few of the Chadwicks' most astonishing discoveries. The Chadwicks do not care to answer objections to their scholarship in print. These sentences lead the way to our most recent Chadwickian controversy, now in the family's archive relating to New Amsterdam, where the Dutch Anglo branch, some with the variant name of Chadwick, contributed greatly to the cultural life of the remote company town. That is New York. Over the course of our recent research, including a trip to Amsterdam, we found ourselves reading the papers of English, American, and Dutch Chadwicks and Chadwikes, who operated as sailors, architects, landscape painters, men of science, financiers, and nautical engineers, among other callings. Many of our breakthroughs came in Dutch archives, as well as some of the perhaps false leads that seemed like breakthroughs at the time. Before I turn to Fort Chadwick, the project with which I'll close, let me prepare the way by familiarizing you with some of the Golden Age Dutch material we've been studying. Though I had the benefit of a nautical education as a child, the trip to Amsterdam also afforded Blatchley a chance to familiarize himself with the rudiments of the sailor's and boatsman's art. Blatchley was in fact so enthusiastic about this new branch of learning that, as an evening diversion after our long days in the archives, he began 2 documentary projects that juxtapose fine examples of recent ship architecture with some of the more exciting nautical yarns from the Chadwick archive. Blatchley pleaded with me to narrate all of these stories today, but since he's not here, I'll just give you a brief sampling from the project that's called Contemporary Sterns. I jumped aloft to take in the main topgallant studding sail, but before I got into the top, the tack parted and away it went, swinging forward of the sail and tearing and slatting itself to pieces. The hallards were at that moment let go by the run, and such a piece of work I never had before in taking in a sail. After great exertions, I got it, or the remains of it, into the top and was making it fast when the captain, looking up, called out to me, "Lay aloft there, Chadwick, and furl that main royal." The mizzen topsail, though new and close reefed, split from head to foot in the bunt. The fore topsail went in one rent from clew to earring and was blowing to tatters. One of the chain bobstays parted. The spirit yard sail sprung in the slings. The martingale had slewed off to leeward, and owing to the long, dry weather, the lee rigging hung in large bights at every lurch. The anchors were then to be taken up to the rail, which kept all hands on rail for an hour, though every now and then the seas broke over it, washing the rigging off to leeward, filling the lee scupper's breast high, and washing chalk aft to the taffrail. The nautical passages that accompany the next mini-project, Swamped Skiffs, are simply too upsetting to repeat here, so I'll just flip through the images. Those of you who've studied this art, Okay, this brings me to the more historically informed part of the recent archival work, which has involved the recovery of a lost treatise and several models relating to 17th century genre painting. Those of you who've studied this art know that one of the most popular forms of literacy in the 17th century among painters was the emblem book, in which an allegorical image, often of daily life, was framed by a brief aphorism, which in turn was unpacked by a short commentary. You also probably know that the Dutch were famous for littering the foreground of their paintings with a copious array of tankards, pipes, cards, oyster shells, pewter dishes, and ambiguously murky objects in what, according to the recent Chadwick's, albeit extreme interpretation, amounts to a kind of proto-scatter art. Here I'll show just a few of the old master canvases in Chadwick Manor. A Jan Steen Merry Company first. A Steen Not So Merry Company, and then 3 details of what the Chadwicks have come to call foreground floor debris. Earlier, however, in the family's history, during the surge of interest in Golden Age Dutch painting in the middle and later 19th century, the Chadwicks not only acquired many of these paintings in their large collection, but had the idea of entering the suddenly burgeoning art historical discourse on Dutch art. It was at that time, apparently, that Chadwick Dalton printed, but did not yet publish, his treatise, Foreground Floor Debris, which takes off on the copious use of strewn material in the country's painting. It remains unpublished, perhaps in part because of the occasional use of low humor and foul language, which blended in with the high theoretical aims of the treatise that Chadwicks felt was an appropriate approach to their subject. We haven't verified the authenticity of all the commentaries yet, and so I'll just read the brief aphorisms that accompany the images. Brush the seed of wisdom, bring chaos whizzing down. A floored book restores snores. Out of hand, the pan falls from its purpose. Peach pit, chicken leg, lemon spoon. Beware the floor where pewter's strewn. For the last 2 of these, which I'm going to show you, I can also show you the Chadwick's, in addition to the image, I can show you the paintings from their collection that they're based on. The first is an Adrian Van Oosted Alchemist, which presents a river of floor debris swirling all the way through the painting. The Chadwickian aphorism runs, "Even lead from gold carries dread from old." The typist fucked that up. Then an Adrian Brower Brawl painting, which of course is only a good representative of a much bigger subgenre that depicts the sudden flip from pleasing ongoingness to its opposite, though the flip itself is arguably presented as ongoing in the art of the period. We saw a version of this in the two Jan Steen paintings from the Merry Company to the Not So Merry Company. In the Not So Merry Company, the time is always right fucking now, or so says the drunkard who's lurched up to brawl. This brings me to the Dutch Inn model, or as is more popularly and recently known, the Golden Age microbrewery, which was on view in Chicago just last week, the 24th through the 28th at the Art Fair Next. As you gaze at this image, I'd like, first of all, to banish the idea of the dollhouse from your head. The Chadwicks were always very touchy about that comparison. And in fact, it was one of the main reservations about letting the study model out of Chadwick Manor. Such a crass comparison is the main reason why the object that was presented in Chicago was not the original, but a reproduction of the even more detailed 17th century Dutch tavern reconstruction that still belongs to the family. As two bachelors who devoted an enormous amount of time to the elaborate construction of what had appeared to most viewers indistinguishable from puppet theaters or miniature playthings, the Chadwicks were forced to appeal to the theoretical works that emerged from these three-dimensional models, like their foreground floor debris, as proof both of their art historical worth and of their difference from the amateurish reproductions of Victorian interiors that remain the imaginative domain of pre-adolescent girls, where Mama and Papa are always right downstairs. Ultimately, it was only through our repeated reassurances that the Chadwicks were prevailed upon to let us construct a reproduction of the original tavern for the benefit of the curious art public. While painters have for centuries used such models to study the effects of light and shadow and the workings of perspectival illusion, Poussin apparently had a series of wax figurines for which he developed special individualized accents. The Chadwicks made rather a different use of their own device. After the purchase of genre paintings for Chadwick Manor, they would restage the speculative events that led to the various brawls, French exits, and to the copious array of mugs, tankards, and pewter dishes that so consistently litter the foreground of Golden Age Dutch paintings. Then Dalton would hold forth to assembled guests, discoursing on his eccentric theory of genre painting through one of the models in windows or doors. Not to be outdone, Torrent, too, used the model for his own purposes. And yet, less interested in the history of painting, Torrent took rather to a kind of ambient genre theater, endlessly casting down tiny tankards, upsetting mugs, and accompanying this activity with imitations of Dutch insults and exclamations. The Chicago viewing of the Golden Age microbrewery marked the first time audiences outside Chadwick Manor have ever seen a reproduction of the device. What the Chadwicks refused to stage in the mall-like context of the art fair, however, was a live reading of the actual poems they read through the model's various portals. So tonight I've brought with me both the original Dutch and the Chadwick's eccentric translation of a text by the 17th century Dutch poet Jacob Cats. Cats was a popular writer whose works on everyday life were eagerly read both by genre painters and their patrons. While there's some doubt about whether the Chadwicks knew enough Dutch to accomplish the translation accurately, those versed in the language can judge for themselves. We feel nonetheless that the Chadwick Dalton's translation captures the multi-voiced atmosphere of the tavern that was the occasional ostensible site of this piece. So I'm going to pass out now these pieces for you. This was a little... Thanks. to the last page, you'll see. It's actually, we've done a little philological work, and it's changed just slightly since the printing. Anybody read Dutch here? Can anyone read? I thought not. I anticipated this. No one will understand. Everyone have them? I have a few. No, I have one more. Up, drove singing, up. We're in all this swigging. Wear 'em swollen tits, into it, rude leggings. Hey, drifthead, sway the gypsy tent, loosen up the folk. Heads crafted in gray night upholstery. Demands suck. Weenies, blackened soup, ketchup, head fleas, you name it. They cannot wear the wrong hair after ardent coming. If you meant true rights off by stairs on descent, that isn't stale yet, they'll mention pints. Guy showing you where to have his van fumigated. Trust after you get most installed, you test for vermin. Guy sold her water scene, your Uncle Lester's dock. Day or night, the reedy dock, her pigeon shitting mud. My own guess is noblest in Holland, yet it takes shaking, weird doorman over lengths of notched osier, solemnly thinking. Comely tones open new yens, bring in a headlight. That late, they're shooting cans and thwacking some old snitch. Yet date a gazelle, 4 ears report to listen. Yet date an icky man, it's all dynasty, Moog investment. Yet date a teary Meg, guess I'll lie down in the uke. Yet date a deep dish wife, it's all staged, indie dude. A cab buying good rock, very shady trucking fellow. I'm there till morning, seeing all the young single moms in. And who is reaching for air guitar? Raging Vince? And who is raising real hair, touching over wigs? Mayor, that is not enough. Wine moldy, unders soaking. Hit at what reddens heads, and underhanded break it. I'll spare you Torrent Chadwick's translation of the same work. I mean, he doesn't come out of a literary background. He has a lot more problems with this kind of work. Though I should mention that it does contain the lines, my guest is new and lost in Holland, yet he's thinking, when dour men over long nights honor all while sinking, which may present a fine micro-image, the best micro-image of the entire project. As fascinating as the Chadwick's work with the Model Inn is, to my mind, the real yield of our recent archival labors had to do with the family's neglected contributions to the architecture of 17th century New Amsterdam. The result was to have been a commemorative vitrine dedicated to one Cornelius van der Chadwijk, architect of New Amsterdam's misunderstood and maligned first fort, which its critics dismissed because its ramparts wobbled slightly and its masses of leaning timbers lent the work an unfinished appearance. Far from accidents or oversights, these aspects of Chadwick's design were in fact based on his inquiry into nature's pelted builder, as he referred to it, the beaver. That Manhattan's first large-scale public building should have been a revolutionary site-specific interpretation of the animal that gave rise to the settlement was, the Chadwicks have long felt, worthy of public recognition. In any case, this monument would have been formally installed on May 5th, 2007 on Hanover Square in the heart of Dutch New York. The fact that the vitrine was not installed that day, apparently because its materials did not meet the standards only vaguely outlined in the contract, was extremely embarrassing for the Chadwicks, since Torrent Chadwick and Chadwick Dalton had themselves led a large public tour of their ancestors' architectural sites that was to have culminated at the vitrine location. Show you a few images inside. The following text, with which I'll conclude, is a rough transcription of the tour, along with a few descriptive notes. We begin on Broad Street, near the southern tip of the island in the 1620s. As those among you with solid elementary school educations know, the Dutch were a water-oriented culture, inclined to reclaim land from the sea and ship goods by canals. When they arrived on this 12-mile island surrounded by readily navigable rivers, their first thought was to reticulate the mainland with a complex network of canals that moved from the tip of the island to Broad Street, which was throughout the 17th century a canal known as Hergracht. As in Old Amsterdam, these canals served several simultaneous functions: barge highways, open public toilets, skiff and barge parking lots, drinking water sources, and sadly mistaken substitutes for bed at the end of less lucky evenings at the Grok-side taverns. Despite Washington Irving's impertinent suggestion that this ambitious project was undertaken solely so that the Dutch could, quote, snuff up the fragrant effluvia of mud and mire, end quote, the canals in fact allowed New Amsterdam citizens to raise water from the Hudson to just below street level, enabling the frictionless passage of goods not only horizontally, but vertically down the river as well, through an ingenious lock system. Over the last several years, through a great deal of lobbying designed to turn often shockingly ungrateful contemporary minds back to the technological triumphs of our earliest New Amsterdam forefathers, rather novel sculptural features have been developed in this neighborhood to recall the bygone era of the New Amsterdam lock system. As in all successful urban public works, this has involved a partnership among historic preservationists, public-minded independent scholars like ourselves, city planners, volunteers, and yes, artists. First, the Chevrolet lock. This moving lock, in which one truck rolls out from its site and closes, and then it opens on the other side. I can show you again, actually. See, now that's in the closed position. It's open, it closes. Let's see. And this lock system was actually surrounded by ceremonial sculptures from the Judd estate that had been, they sort of, I guess they double as traffic control, but they're sort of down there in the same area. Though we prefer to call this inventive public piece, I'm now speaking of the next one I'm about to show you, by its proposed name, the Chadwick lock system, the city refers to it instead as the Governor Stuyvesant lock, as though Stuyvesant weren't a name already known enough in New York City. Several other examples have been placed near Wall Street, though this is an area beyond the original scope of the canal system, as we objected vociferously to the city. And this is it. Nonetheless, we feel that the monument is a distinct success. With even greater economy than the Chevrolet lock, the metal doors of this lock system, designed by the sculptor Richard Serra, vanish through a thin slot in the asphalt, allowing us to imagine the change in water level that would lower or raise crafts inside. Though a number of ignorant populists on the city council have bemoaned the turn toward abstraction in public monuments, we feel, on the contrary, that the 17th century's power is best honored by forward-looking, contemporary rather than nostalgic public art. The beaver, as many of you know, was the animal most responsible for the settlement of New Amsterdam. Long before its pelt was a prime commodity, secretions of its scent gland were believed to have medicinal properties. For both of these reasons, the beaver was hunted to extinction by the 16th century in Great Britain and to near extinction soon after throughout the continent. In New Amsterdam, where beavers in the surrounding forests were almost miraculously plentiful, the Dutch fastened on both the beaver's main attributes. No less a learned lawyer than Adrian van der Donck, trained as he was in Leiden before emigration, believed that beaver oil cured rheumatism, toothaches, stomach aches, poor vision, and dizziness, and that beaver testicles, rubbed on the forehead or dried and dissolved in water, made an effective antidote to drowsiness and idiocy. While rheumatism is not the problem it once was, Torrent took the liberty on the tour of preparing a small vial of crushed beaver testicles to combat these last maladies, drowsiness and idiocy, among the members of the curious gathering. I'm not going to show you an image of that. It was embarrassing. We now come to the site of Fort Amsterdam, designed to present the Native Americans and British with an insurmountable physical barrier, behind which, this is not the building, by the way, you can understand that, behind which the central organs of government and finance could wait out a siege. We will not even nibble at the easy irony of its transformation now into the Bankruptcy Court and Native American Museum. The conjunction itself is cruel enough. We will merely remark that though there was some kind of structure in this spot since the early 1620s, it was enlarged in the 1630s after an influx of cash from the capturing of a Spanish fleet in Havana made its way to the colony. And the fort, however, has remained an enigma from the moment of its expansion. Listen now to a description of the fort from a book published recently by a popular historian. The original plan was for a vast structure in which all the colonists would live, save from the savages of the country. But the savages didn't seem so savage, and anyway, it was clearly impossible given the manpower to do anything very grand. The governor ordered a redesign. The man who had been sent over to build the fort was apparently uniquely unskilled for a Dutch engineer. The original structure was comprised mostly of heaped earth. It began to crumble even before it was finished. It would be torn down and rebuilt over the next several years. Indeed, the ramshackle state of Fort Amsterdam would be an issue right up until the moment when Peter Stuyvesant, standing on one of its unsteady ramparts, would agree to surrender it to the English. It's passages like this, still streaming forth from the press as late as 2004, that continued to malign the Chadwick family as they did in the 17th century, when critics began to dismiss the fort for not coinciding with received wisdom about seats of government. Such Philistines have been unable for almost 400 years now to recognize its radical approach to enclosure. For this uniquely unskilled Dutch engineer, here unnamed, was none other than our relative Cornelius van der Chadwyck, a gentleman raised and educated in Rotterdam, first a hydraulic engineer on the Zuider Zee, and later, after some unfortunate dike accidents, an immigrant to New Amsterdam. This fort may well have been unnecessary, as our simpleton chronicler suggests, but its entropic effect as Manhattan's first earth scraper was surely no accident. Nor is this generation of Chadwicks the first to raise their pens in ire against our relative's slander. Nearly 200 years ago, Cornelius's archive was in the possession of Walter Chadwick, an amateur historian and expert model builder, ship models mostly, who went by the Dutchified name Wouter. Wouter shot back against Washington Irving's attack, both on his relatives and on the Dutch more generally, in a book called A Fluid Fortress of Verse, an epic poem upon the remarkable life of Cornelius van der Chadwyck, from which I'll read you just a little section. Woe befell Cornelius with the breaking of his dike, for Dutch soldiers now chased him with halberds and pikes. His native lands became to him but barren wastes, and he was forced to stow away, post haste. Fastened obsequiously to an architect for the navigation, he was a credentialed builder upon the man's expiration. But lacking commissions upon the lad's arrival, he was forced to trap beavers for his survival. Where follow demented passages in Cornelius's private book, staring perhaps too closely at the pelted builder's work. So close his countrymen's aqueous manipulation, neat feeding ponds to their draining of inundation. Dutchmen beavers, beavers Dutch, killing a furry countryman now rankled him such that upon his mind a monument swum like logs floating among pond scum. There's a great deal more to say about Cornelius's monument, but we'll approach it gradually, breaking Wouter's verse just as he's picking up steam. It was at a small shanty at this address, which, according to neighbors, had the jagged appearance of a beaver dam, that Cornelius settled with his wife Hetty Vessels after his trapping period. Here he worked as a bargeman on the canal in front, moving pelts between the collection station at the end of the fort and the harbor at the end of the canal, while practicing his novel, nautical songs. As Holland began its tulip mania in 1634, in which eventually one rare bulb would be sold for more than the value of a house, so Cornelius began what may be termed his beaver mania. Interested not only in their status as architects, but in the fact that, like productive colonies, beavers continue to grow throughout their lives, Cornelius filled several sketchbooks with then-current natural historical knowledge about the animal, as well as sketches of beaver dams and beaver memorials. The ink for these drawings itself mixed with beaver gland secretions, creating certain archival problems for later Chadwicks. We're now looking at the Chadwicks discoursing at the site of what sadly remains, until the installation of our vitrine, Lower Manhattan's central monument to its Dutch Golden Age architectural heritage, where, partly visible underneath the condensation-lined viewing portals, two period buildings, the Stadhuis and Lovelace Tavern, are represented by at least 47 mostly complete stones, nearly identical to the kind of stones out of which these buildings would have been constructed. These monuments were established in 1979 and 80 when the excavation of the postmodern plaza that you saw in the last image ran across extensive archaeological remains from New Amsterdam. Indeed, it was the problem of disposing of the Dutch archaeological material that ultimately led workers to seek the cheaper solution of working it into the plaza. 10,000 pipe fragments, 11,000 pieces of glass, and 23,000 shards of ceramic and pottery were ultimately recovered and then covered again. As important as it was to count all of these items before they were reinterred, we feel nonetheless that the money spent in this process might better have been directed to other ends. More, as fine as these two building fragments are, we feel that the close relation between them, since the function of the Stadhuis in fact moved to the tavern once the former was declared unsafe, has rather confirmed later audiences in their view of the Dutch as drunken trenchermen incapable of legislation than revised this clearly inadequate historical understanding. But we jump ahead to Wouter's poem. Van Twiller, Kieft, and Stuyvesant eat up our precious trees, with yawning tales of yawning fools inept in all degrees. But were the Dutch surveyed aright atop of Chadwick's fort, their contributions to New York would rest beyond retort. We grant, indeed, the fort did slope, its lumber did decay, but if the ramparts swayed a bit, they were designed to sway. How better monumentalize the pelted builder's plan than see the seat of government itself as but a dam? Provisional and perfect, but built by human beings who might in turn revise their seat within the frame of things. For one thing is for certain, and this Cornelius knew, governments that timeless seem aren't governments that grow. As the tricentennial of the founding of New Amsterdam approached in 1909, a number of historians began to grow curious about the Dutch origins of the island, and indeed a period of Holland mania seized not merely the city, but the country as a whole. It was to this period that we date these theme park-like reconstructions of 17th century houses, Dutch houses, that is. At the height of this Holland mania in 1904, long-lost Manhattanite Henry James returned to his birthplace after 30 years in Europe. Obsessed, too, about commemorative cultural monuments, though of a different scale, James promptly visited the site of the house where he was born, discovering that, as he put it, quote, whereas the inner sense had positively erected there for its private contemplation a commemorative mural tablet, the very wall that should have borne this inscription had been smashed, as if for demonstration that tablets in New York are unthinkable. This little parable has provided a haunting backdrop for our efforts. Afraid that James was still right and thinking it safer to sink our tablet into the ground in the form of a commemorative vitrine, we have, after considerable administrative haggling, happily discovered that indeed New York can think tablets. Now again, I'm reading from you this transcript of what happened at the time. It's sad that the Chadwicks turned out to be so ironically mistaken. They found this park under construction. It really seemed an ideal fit. Our first proposal had been a full-scale reconstruction of the fort at the currently unused section of the city, the base of Rector Street. But when this was poo-pooed by some sentimental members of the city council, we turned to the design of the smaller monument whose installation site at Hanover Square was undergoing reconstruction and would thus be a perfect site for the new monument. Well, as we've already suggested, the Chadwicks were more than a little surprised to find out that on this auspicious day, with their group of eager onlookers following, and they have their family banner in the background there too, following them in the triumphant moment, their monument remained uninstalled because of some bureaucratic snags. I quote here from the exchange. Dalton. What? Our monument isn't installed? What kind of vicious insult is this, with our flock eager to see Cornelius finally enshrined? How dare you stand idly by, park and rec man? Bend your back over a shovel. Don't use that haughty language with me, Dalton. You know as well as I do that it's your fault that this piece of excrement can't pass as a public memorial. The monument, as per our contract, was supposed to be, and I quote, finely sculpted in bronze and securely housed in a concrete frame topped with bulletproof glass. What is this anyway? Paper? Felt? A little plexiglass? Who sprung for that? We gave you over $30,000 of municipal money. Where is it? It's in Atlantic City, isn't it, Torrent? We have reports of your shouting at porters, half-naked, waving bills around. At this point, the Chadwicks, somewhat flustered, retired with their group to the family's long-standing downtown haunt, the India Club. And that's the India Club at the other end of the, and I'll show you the second image of the close-up. Hello, Smithson. We'll be taking our thirsty tour to one of the private nautical suites upstairs. This is what happened at the door. Be good enough to have the steward send up a case of brandy to go with the two usual ones of claret. I'm sorry, sir, but your membership has been revoked. There must be some mistake. Our ancestors have been attending this club since it opened as an offshoot of the West India Company in the 17th century. Well, your ancestors paid their bills. Perhaps you should try the Ulysses pub around the corner. They cater to the rabble that wanders in from the street, but they do require cash. At this point, the tour, like this reading, came to a sudden and unceremonious close.
Thank you, Lydell, in all of your many-hattedness. Before you disperse, I want to invite you to instantly regather down the hall in the English Lounge for a reception, so you can break bread with the poet and archivist and any possible Chadwicks. And before you do that, please come up to the front and look at the non-archival work by Lydell up here for sale. And let me end by just thanking Hilary Gravendike, my co-curator, for all her work this semester and in the fall with that curator, Lynn Higinian, and to remind you to keep coming here, although not over the summer. In the fall, I believe the lineup includes Michael McClure, David Marriott, Carolyn Bergvall, and Tom Picard. So that should be a good lineup. See you in autumn and down the hall. Thank you.